So I just want to talk to you about a process called deamination and transamination. And these are two processes for the breakdown of proteins. And these are, again, happening in the liver. Okay? So with deamination, this is where we're going to break down the proteins and we're going to remove the amine group, that NH2 group, off of the amino acids. Okay? And then that group is going to form two things. So if we don't need to use these amino acids at all, they're going to be converted into urea, and they're going to be converted into ammonia. And these two waste products, and by the way, urea can also be referred to as uric acid, these two waste products are cleaned out of the bloodstream by the kidneys, and then you flush those down the toilet. Now with transamination, this is going to be removal of the nitrogen from the amino acids. And then the rest of that carbon group can then be converted into glucose or converted into fat. And then we can use that for an energy source. So when we just break it down to get rid of it because we don't need it, it's a waste product now, we call that deamination. When we want to convert it to glucose or convert it to fat, we take the amine group off and then use the carbons that are left, and that's our transamination. So again, we talked about the fact that proteins can be used for gluconeogenesis, and that means we're going through that transamination, we're making the glucose, and then sometimes that glucose can be stored as glycogen in the liver later. So we know that that is a very important process in case that we need that energy source later on. And then excessive protein, like we said, can be converted into fat and also stored for energy. All right, so we've talked about this. We're going to kind of skip through this. What are the functions of the proteins in the body? One of the functions we know, connective tissue, making tendons, ligaments, bones, causes skin elasticity, for the collagen, strength also for the bones, helps us with movement such as skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle. We have proteins for transportation such as actin and myosin. We have microtubules. All of these are important inside the cell. And then we also know that proteins are catalysts that can speed up or slow down chemical reactions. So sometimes you'll hear people say that an enzyme is a catabolic enzyme, or sometimes you'll hear people say it's an anabolic enzyme. So if it's an anabolic enzyme, it's building something, right? If it's a catabolic enzyme, it's tearing something apart. So usually anabolic enzymes make reactions go faster, and catabolic enzymes usually help to pull things apart and digest things or slow down reactions that are occurring. We also know that some of the hormones of our body are made out of proteins. And then I also want to tell you that there is a type of hormone in our system that is a transport hormone. And these let me back that up. These are transport proteins. Didn't mean to say hormone. So we have some protein hormones, and then we also have transport proteins, and these transport proteins, they actually help to transport and bind to other hormones in our body. So they may bind to steroid hormones, they could bind to other protein hormones. And what's kind of interesting about these transport proteins is that when they bind with these hormones floating around in our bloodstream, they cause the hormones to become inactive. Why would that be helpful to have proteins that can bind with hormones in our blood and make them inactive. Why would we want that?
So we can stop the effect.
Say it again?
Like certain types of hormones are released during pregnancy.
Okay,
Pregnancy.
so we don't want them to work, is that what you're saying?
Right.
Okay, okay.
Certain things like with positive reactions, you need them, not reactions. Yes, positive feedback, sometimes you need an off switch to them.
Okay, so kind of sort of like that too. So these are hormones, we don't want them, obviously, to be doing anything. But sometimes you want those hormones to be right there, ready to use. So instead of having to wait for them to be secreted someplace, get into the bloodstream, travel around, then get to wherever the cell needs it for that reaction to occur, if you already have them floating around in your blood just waiting for the opportunity to be used, it would be a much faster response. But maybe we don't need them right this second. So what we do is we bind them with a protein, and a lot of times you'll hear them called a protein globulin because they're globs, okay? So we bind this hormone with a glob of protein and it inactivates the protein. But the second we need that protein, or excuse me, the second we need that hormone, the glob falls off. And now the hormone is right there at the ready to be used for the body. So it helps to make reactions go a lot faster. So these kind of globulin hormones are very, very important so that, or globulin proteins, I keep getting those words confused in my head. These globulin proteins are very important to allow the hormones to be right there on the spot whenever we need them, but not active when we don't need them, okay? Now, one other protein that I want you to know the name of, this is a protein called albumin. And albumin is necessary to help to regulate fluid in our blood and to help to regulate fluid in our tissues. Okay? So we need to go over this. And we just barely cover this in physio. So if this is, let's say, a blood capillary, okay? We've got some kind of capillary, and with every single capillary in our body, paralleling that capillary is also a lymphatic capillary. So we have blood capillaries, we have lymphatic capillaries. And remember, last time I told you that lymphatic capillaries, like the one that's found inside our digestive tract, they have valves. And all the lymphatic capillaries have valves. So if something pushes on that valve, it will open, and whatever that something is that's pushing on that valve, it's able to then enter into that lymphatic capillary. So something else that you're aware of, and that is that in this capillary we have blood pressure. There's some kind of pressure in there. And usually, give or take a little bit, the blood pressure in most capillaries is somewhere around 30 millimeters of mercury. Now remember, our blood capillaries are made up of a single cell. That's all that makes up the wall. It's one cell thick. And so it's real easy for things to just move out of blood capillaries. And something that's really easy to move out of blood capillaries is water. And this pressure is enough to push water right out of our capillaries. So if you can think of this pen like a blood capillary, water is just squirting out of it from all sides. It's like it's a leaky hose that somebody poked a bunch of holes into it, and water is just squirting out of this capillary. Now, it seems rather silly that you'd have water squirting out of your capillaries all day long, because what would happen after a while? You dehydrate, What would happen to your blood pressure?
No.
It would drop, you'd die. So what the heck do we have this set up for? Well, the other thing that has a tendency to come out of these capillaries when the water gets pushed out are things like, oh, I don't know, bacteria, or things like, oh, viruses. Stuff that shouldn't be in your blood also has a tendency to be pushed out of your blood as the water is pushed out. And much of this water then sweeps into your lymphatic capillaries, sweeping the bacteria and the viruses into the lymphatic capillaries as well, because this lymphatic fluid is going to take all this stuff to the lymph nodes. And the lymph nodes is where your immune system likes to hide out. And any bacteria or viruses that might get into your bloodstream get to the lymph nodes. Now we can kill these suckers. And you don't get as sick. Nice. However, we got another problem because the water that's seeping out of here is a lot of water. A lot. It's so much so that it could kill you in minutes. Except it doesn't, because we have something else inside our capillaries, and this is something called albumin. Albumin is a protein that creates something we call oncotic pressure. Oncotic pressure is only created by proteins, and the protein that creates this most often is the protein albumin. And we find albumin floating around in very large quantities in our bloodstream. Water is highly attracted to albumin. So that 90% of the water that gets pushed out of these capillaries headed towards the lymphatic system, albumin sucks it back in. So by osmosis, the water goes right back to where albumin is, and we lose about 10% of that water, but that's not a problem because that water, after it gets cleaned in the lymphatic system, gets dumped right back into your bloodstream, and you're good to go.
With or without bacteria?
Well, I hope without.
Okay.
Hopefully it got cleaned first and then dumped back into your bloodstream. So it goes through the lymph nodes, hits your immune system, gets cleaned all out, and then that clean water goes back into your bloodstream. Everything's working right. Fingers crossed.
Is it just a constant, like, when you said osmosis, it's just higher concentration inside the bloodstream and then outside it's lower and water rushes out and then it gets attracted back to the albumin?
Yes, so there is no albumin out here in this extracellular region. All the albumin is in here. So water is going to go from high concentration of water back to low concentration of water. And it's a lower concentration because there's always lots and lots of albumin here. Does that make sense? Okay, good. So albumin becomes extremely, extremely important in helping us to maintain fluid in our bloodstream and also to help us to regulate how much fluid goes into the lymphatics versus doesn't.
So someone that has cirrhosis, do they create too much albumin? And
Too
then
little.
they get- too little.
Too little.
So why do they get it?
Hold that question. We're not going to go there quite yet, but we will, I promise. So proteins also help with acid-base regulation a little bit as well, because proteins have that acid portion, which is the carboxylic acid, and then the amine portion is basic. So proteins have the ability to bond hydrogen ions. They also have the ability to bond hydroxyl ions. So with certain proteins in the blood, if you don't have enough buffer, that bicarbonate ion, if you don't have enough of that, you can use some of your proteins in the blood as a type of buffer in order to keep acid-base balance. So we talked about proteins transporting substances, hemoglobin, and then, for instance, it also transports things like our hormones, that type of thing. We know proteins are antibodies. We talked about that, part of the immune system. And proteins, if we need to break them down as a fuel source, they can provide us energy. And they provide us about 4 kilocalories per gram. Very similar, well, I shouldn't say very similar, the same as what a carbohydrate can provide us. But now here's one of the other things. Proteins help to control your satiety or your appetite. So there are 2 hormones that you should know about. One is called ghrelin. The other is called leptin. Now, these hormones are pretty new. I mean, they've been in our body for a long time, but only recently have scientists even known that they exist. Because I got to tell you, if you become a scientist and you want to study the human body, nobody wants to study the gastrointestinal system. It's like, boring, yucky, ew, who wants to study this? But all of a sudden, you know, God bless America, we're all getting fat. So now all these pharmaceutical companies go, I know a way to make money. We need to find something that controls appetite. So there's billions of dollars being thrown at studying the gastrointestinal system. And we're finding a bunch of hormones that we didn't know that the GI tract makes. And ghrelin and leptin are 2 of those hormones. So ghrelin, this is a very important hormone because one of the things it does is it tells you you are hungry. It wants you to know you're hungry. And the more ghrelin you produce, the hungrier you become. Now we make this in our intestines. We make this in our pancreas. We actually also produce ghrelin in the brain. What part of the brain do you think ghrelin affects? What part of the brain? If it's the one that helps to tell us we're hungry, which part of the brain is it going to affect? That's a good guess. There you go. Right? We've got that hunger satiety center. So ghrelin is made by the stomach, or excuse me, by the small intestine, by the pancreas, by the brain, and it is sending signals to the hunger center. You're hungry, eat, eat, eat. Now what we need to do is find a way to stop it. Don't let ghrelin send those signals, right? So then along comes these scientists who found the second important hormone called leptin. And the job of leptin is to send signals to the satiety center to say you're full, you're full, you're full. So let's package leptin into pills, give people pills of leptin, and this should do it. Dang those hormones. They typically don't just do one single friggin' job. Because now here's the problem. We find out leptin doesn't just affect whether you're hungry or you're full. Leptin also affects how much thyroid hormone you make. Leptin also helps to regulate the size of your blood vessels so your blood pressure stays up. Leptin regulates parts of your immune system. Leptin regulates heart rate. And if I give you too much leptin, you'll make too much thyroid hormone. Your blood pressure will go too high. Your heart rate will go too high. This is bad. Dang it. So here they thought they could just cut off ghrelin and give you leptin and everybody would be happy. Now here's the other thing about ghrelin. Ghrelin also does actually affect the hippocampus, and ghrelin has an antidepressant portion to it. It makes you feel happy. You may be hungry, but you're also happy. So if I cut off your ghrelin, you may not be as hungry, but you're going to be majorly depressed. I'd rather just be fat and happy. So now this becomes a big mess, and what do you do about this? And so here these pharmaceutical companies thought they had the pill that was going to make them billions, and it turns out, I can't use this. So now they're all depressed. They don't have enough ghrelin, I think, so. We're going to skip some of this and go here. What are the best food sources of protein? Eggs, meat, soy, depending on who you are, and dairy. You don't want to consume too much soy because chemicals in soy can actually suppress your thyroid hormone production. So you have to be careful of too much soy as your protein source. And we talked about serving size. You know that bar of soap is about 3 ounces of meat, and that's recommended twice a day. What happens if you eat too much or too little protein? So if I have too much protein in my diet, now remember, I eat protein. It goes into my stomach, it goes into my small intestine, I digest it down into separate amino acids. The whole protein doesn't get into my bloodstream. What gets into my bloodstream are the separate amino acids. I always try to tell people this because they think, oh, well, I'm drinking this protein powder, and this protein powder is going to be the same protein that is built in my cell. And so these proteins are going to make my muscles bigger. No, sorry, your body has a mind of its own. It's going to break this down into individual amino acids and build whatever the heck protein it feels like building. And if it doesn't need to build a protein, it's going to store it away as fat. So it doesn't work that way. So now, if I eat too much protein, now I'm going to have a lot of amino acids floating in my bloodstream. And do you remember the definition of this word? Tonicity or osmolarity. What does that mean?
Something to do with solute.
Something. What else? Who else said something? I heard something. This is like all the way back to stoichiometry. We talk about it in stoichiometry. I didn't want to bring that up. I know it hurts. What's tonicity mean? Like hypotonic, hypertonic?
It's like the number of particles in a solution.
Beautiful. So this is the number of particles of anything in a solution. So if you think of the solution as your blood and the particles as amino acids, okay? Think of it that way. So let's say I have this setup here. I have a beaker, okay? And I'm going to fill my beaker with a solution that has a lot of amino acids. Lots and lots and lots of amino acids. And then I'm going to put into my beaker this, I'll draw a different color because red doesn't do it. I'm going to put into my beaker this bag, okay? And we're going to pretend that this bag is my tissues, okay? Not nearly as many amino acids in here, okay? So lots of amino acids floating around in this solution, which is going to be like my blood. And in the bag, not so many amino acids. By osmosis, which way will water go? Water is moving out. So now I have high blood pressure. Because I'm losing water from the tissues. However, one of the other things that we see becomes an issue, okay, is that eventually by drinking all this protein powder all the time, my body actually decreases its ability to make albumin. So now I have lower than normal albumin in my blood. What happens when I have lower than normal albumin in my blood? I now have increased edema in my tissues. So I just jumped ahead of myself. I apologize. So I have two issues. I have high blood pressure. I stop making as much albumin, and then I will also have edema in my tissues. Now, albumin is made in the liver. So Perla just brought up something about, what happens when somebody has cirrhosis of the liver and the liver isn't working appropriately. They cannot make as much albumin. This increases massive amounts of edema in the tissues, so much so that they might have something called ascites. What's ascites? You have this massively swollen abdomen full of water. And you'll see this, they'll literally walk into the emergency room sloshing, okay? Because their abdomen is so full of water. And that's due to destruction of the liver. So now I have lots and lots of amino acids floating around in the bloodstream. My blood pressure has gone up. And I need to get rid of these amino acids so my kidneys start working overtime to kind of get those amino acids out of the system. One of the problems is, as the amino acids enter into the kidneys, they change the pH of the urine. Because amino acids typically cause pH in the urine to go up. And anytime the pH of our urine gets too basic, then we see calcium stones forming and uric acid crystals forming, and you get kidney stones. And so lots and lots of protein in the diet, mostly from protein powder. It's really difficult to consume that much protein at one setting. It can be done, but it's difficult to keep doing it over and over and over again unless you're drinking it in a powder. And then it seems easier for the system to handle it. Because if you keep eating massively huge steaks, you're probably going to vomit, okay? But you can pound that protein powder and it seems to be okay. So we have these kidney stones developing, and then one of the weird things occurs is that when the kidney stones start to develop, we see hormonal changes, and we see changes in parathyroid hormone and changes in calcitonin hormone. What does parathyroid hormone do? Do you remember? So calcitonin comes from the thyroid. Parathyroid hormone comes from the parathyroid glands, which are behind the thyroid. Calcitonin increases calcium absorption by bones. So that means the level of calcium in the blood goes down. Parathyroid hormone does the opposite. And parathyroid hormone increases calcium levels in the blood. And when people have these kidney stones, it seems like something occurs to the parathyroid gland to cause it to make more than the normal amount of parathyroid hormone. And so calcium gets leached out of their bone. And we see people who drink high levels of protein for long periods of time, they develop osteoporosis younger, which is just weird. It has also been suggested that high levels of protein in the diet cause colon cancer, although there's not a lot of scientific research to back that up. So I'm just throwing that out there, but we don't know if it really, really does that. We can also have something called protein energy malnutrition, and this basically means the person's diet is very poor. So they don't intake enough food, they don't have enough protein in their diet, and this can be at any age, okay? And of course, this becomes a very serious problem for them, and this is one of the places where we see people with the really bad ascites, the immune system malfunctions, bacterial infections go up, especially in the intestines. They have all kinds of issues because they just don't have the protein nutrition levels that they need to have. These are just some diseases in third world countries. Kwashiorkor is severe protein deficiency. Marasmus is a deficiency in just the amount of calories somebody eats in a day, which then also typically means that they don't have enough protein in their diet. And you can imagine it interrupts growth. And so these people are typically very short, they're very weak, very apathetic. You mix these two where they have very low calorie diets and they have very low protein in their diet, and you're talking basically a concentration camp victim. So they're very emaciated and they're very, very unhealthy.